a little bit. I'm glad to be back with you. I'm going to talk on something that I have only touched on in passing over the last several years, but I want to get deeper into it. Some of my recent lives, I've been talking about education, the re education of the Negro, God is a Black woman, right? The approach that I have taken in educating my daughter. And I have to tell you that of all the things that I've done in this life, I have had some sizable accomplishments. I would like, bigger ones, of course. Um, but my daughter is my greatest accomplishment. And I know most parents will say this because it's like, oh, I love my kid. My kid is awesome. But no, for me, her intellectual development makes me incredibly proud because there are very few people that I can have a really straight up intellectual conversation with, and they will meet me at my level. And my 17-year-old daughter is extremely intelligent and extremely capable of grasping the deeply futuristic, deeply world making, deeply new world integrated sort of teachings that I share with her. So shout out to Ye, really proud of you. And some of the conversations been having with you all lately, I've been really looking to suss out my approach to educating her, and yeah, and just being able to sort of integrate that in a way that lays out my approach to education. If you don't know me, if you do know me, remind you, founder of Nora Labs, creator of Portal X. At Nora Labs, we inspire and operationalize Black liberation through art, tech, and community building. The art includes Noir Fest, our traveling film festival. Noir Press is more of the information and the curation of different forms of art, where we're crafting a liberated Black future through storytelling. Portal X is a technology, your pocket companion to your North Star. It's meant to help walk alongside you, guide you daily as you fulfill your goals, as you hit your milestones on your way to becoming your highest vibrational self, or your highest self, your best identity, right? And so I was working on this almost full time. So my choice to go to grad school was twofold, right? I wanted to create a body of knowledge that would support liberation work, that would support my community, my communities in liberation work. And I wanted to have a container in which I could build my social enterprise with support and with a testing ground, right? And so after about 13 years in New York, 12 years in New York, working in tech, working with clients like FedEx and Verizon, and major hedge funds all over New York and the East Coast, I was called to grad school, right? I had much earlier decided that I was going to get a PhD. It was many, many years before I actually applied. I had taken my GRE, and there were some personal crises that kept me from actually pursuing grad school at that time. And so years later, when I finally got ready, I I literally, before my GRE score expired, which was a pretty decent score, my spirit was just like, apply, apply, apply. And so the day that the application was due for Yale African Studies, um, the master's program, I got my application, and I had been working on it a little bit, but I got really serious about it that very day. And look at God. The day of refreshing, or the week of refreshing at Abundant Life Christian Center, I got my Yale admission, and I got a job offer from Verizon. And so when it was time to make the decision about going to Yale, I was definitely hemming and hawing, because who wants to go and be a poor grad student when you have a six-figure salary? Okay. But this was what God wrought. It was all she wrote. And so I had to leave my corporate life. I mean, there were some other things that made me leave that life, but ultimately I made the decision to leave my comfortable life in Brooklyn, uproot myself and my daughter, and go to Yale on intuition, right, on spirit's guidance. And so after my 2 years at Yale, within which I was busting my behind, I was working round the clock. I had multiple student jobs. I was building the baseline for my social enterprise, building on top of what I had done in New York. doing fellowship. I got the most prestigious entrepreneurship fellowship from Yale at the Sci-City, with the Sci-City Summer Fellowship. We got funding to incorporate our businesses, build our websites, like really get started as a social enterprise. And that was the fall 2019 when I went to Cambridge. So I got into Cambridge as a GATE scholar. So shout out to Raquel Silva, who connected me with her friend who was a GATE scholar at the time, he then gave me his pointers on the application process. Shout out to Damar Lewis, who had also been really supportive in terms of the PhD application process in general. I had applied to many PhD programs, and I got into two. I got into Yale's, and I got into Cambridge as a GATE scholar. So I started that fall in Cambridge. We uprooted our lives, put everything in storage, and flew across the ocean to start a life in Cambridge, my daughter and I. And it was magical at first, to be honest. There was something very magical about Cambridge. I remember us being in an Airbnb the week or two before we left, and there was a book about the most beautiful places in the world, right? And Cambridge was like number one. And when we got there, I wouldn't say it was the most beautiful place in the world, but it was definitely, um, a particular type of beauty to Cambridge. It was very serene. There were all these lakes and ponds with ducks, and it was very green and lush. That was the thing that struck me the most about the UK, was like these people who violently took industrialization everywhere in the world. That place looked like farmland everywhere, right? And so in Cambridge, everybody had an apple tree, everybody had gardens. It was wild to me, but yes, deeply soothing environment in the sense that it was calm, it was clean, it was green, it was serene. And so after busting my behind at Yale for 2 years, I was really tired. And so part of what we're going to talk about, in this conversation is the health element of like my leaving Cambridge. But I know that the summer after I graduated Yale, it was that summer that I did the fellowship, the entrepreneurial fellowship. I had a major flare up. Right, I've dealt with chronic inflammation, chronic health challenges for a very long time, and that particular summer was like the worst flare up I had ever had, and I was just a mess. Right. But thankfully, the program gave me a lot of grace, and I was able to slowly sort of nurse myself back. But then I got much more serious about like, the healing path and seeing a naturopath and getting the support that I needed. And so when I got to Cambridge, I'm sharing that because the reason that I took it very easy at Cambridge, right? When you do PhDs in the UK, you don't have to take classes, whereas in the US, you got to take classes, you got to teach, right? In this particular program, especially, but generally PhD programs, you don't have to take coursework. It's optional, right? And so I leaned into that, being that I had been, I was tired. I had been busting my behind for years. I chose to take it really easy and not overdo it, not overwork myself. And that gave me the space also to focus on Neurolabs, focus on my business, right? And so we had a core team at that time that was really started to get integrated, starting to know each other better. And it allowed us to really build the foundation in terms of our marketing, our messaging, our decks, etc., our fundraising strategies, our plan for revenue, etc. All of this was happening in my first year at Cambridge, while I was also doing the initial reading and initial research to engage the topic that I wanted to focus on for my dissertation. So I got to Cambridge. My focus was Nigerian immigrant identity across the diaspora. So I was really looking at comparative studies and comparative data between the US and the UK. At Yale, my African master's thesis was on Nigerian immigrant identity across New York, Tokyo, and Mumbai. So I had the privilege of visiting Tokyo with my daughter, visiting India, visiting Mumbai with my daughter, engaging Nigerian populations in those places, as well as doing some research with folks in New York that, where I had lived for some time, right? So this topic, when I got to Cambridge, the time between I had my application, which had been like fall of November, December of 2018. By the time I got to Cambridge in fall of 2019, a lot had changed. I had evolved in different ways. And so as much as I was still interested in looking at Nigerian immigrants, I was leaning more towards focusing on the creative element, right, of this population. And I could say so much about why I chose this topic, But there were two things, and that I always share with people when I coach people on how to position yourself for applications and programs. One was looking at my trajectory and what I had done, what had been most consistent in my history and my work in New York, and how I could articulate that in a way that demonstrated my interest for research, right? And so, me applying to Yale and talking about my work with the Yoruba Cultural Institute and Applause Africa and the Nollywood Diaspora Film Series, all these different cultural spaces that I had helped to create and cultivate, how that tied into my interest in focusing deeply on Nigerian immigrants and Nigerian immigrant identity, right? So this was kind of like, I really wanted to tell our stories because I knew that the public understanding of Nigerian immigrants had a lot to do with education, which we're going to be getting into with this conversation about, Cambridge and spiritual futurism in the academy. Um, yeah, Nigerians are obsessed with education, right? And part of that is because there's an obsession with status that is in the more, sort of elite classes, which I hate that word, but um, for most people, it's really about survival, right? It's really about knowing that the path to a secure future, the path to uh, a sustainable, income is education, is through education, right? And so even the poorest Nigerian is invested in getting an education. They will sell everything. They will sell their organs in order to educate their children, especially when living in poverty, because there's an understanding that if you can educate your child well enough that that child can build a prosperous life for themselves, then that child can come back to the family and contribute to the family and help the family to elevate, right, from whatever social strata that they are in, right? And so in most places where there is an intellectual culture, where there is um, a culture that is interested in knowledge, knowledge production, knowledge cultivation, you will see a deep investment in education, generally speaking. All right. So then the question becomes, what type of education is important to that population, which is what we're going to get into. So got to Cambridge in the fall, um, was looking at Nigerian immigrant identity across US, UK, and then with more of a focus on the creative class, I wanted to look at what I call the transnational elite, and I use elite pejoratively. Um, and so when the pandemic happened, right, there's a lot of things that changed with the pandemic, of course, but one key thing was that I lost interest in my research topic at that time. I had a wonderful advisor. Shout out to Ali Megji. He was super supportive and super just insightful, and he was really interested in a lot of the same topics, which is why he allowed me to come and study under him. I'm going to turn the music down a little bit. Um, so when I changed my topic, when I kind of expressed that I was losing interest in this topic and I was really more curious about solutions, right? Looking at the state of the world and how my research and my work could be more intentional about supporting a shift in how our world was structured, right? He introduced me to the book World Making After Empire by Adam Getachew, right? So this was the first time I became really aware of the concept of world making, right? For those who may not know, there's a number of different scholars, and I'm forgetting the name of the primary book that I have here in my collection somewhere. Neil Goodman, I want to say, Neil something, wrote a book on world making. There's a lot of different texts that introduce world making in terms of storytelling, in terms of film and media. Um, Adom Gerachew's book talked about world making, post-colonial world making, right? So African countries, how they were remaking the world in terms of the policies that they were uh, pushing forth in terms of how they engage with the Western world, how they engage with the former colonial powers, right? Or let's remove former. So there's a lot of different sort of ways to approach the term world making, but ultimately it has to do with how we structure our world, right? How we build institutions, we build practices, we build systems that shape our world fundamentally. So my topic then became world making through cultural production. I was really excited about this topic because it allowed me to still go deep with the sort of African, transnational African creative class, but now I got to open it up beyond Nigerians. I was looking, at Africans and Black diasporans, particularly people who had access to both worlds, who had access to the African experience as well as the Western or the diaspora experience, right? And so as I got more interested in this topic, and I started to make progress in my writing, I was like at the same time building Noir Labs, hosting Black Genius podcast, publishing on Noir Press, cultivating a team, leading an organization. I had about 11 people on my team at this time. And I started to carve out time for writing more, and all sorts of things were coming out. Right? One of the key secrets in terms of the academy and applying to grad school in particular is your writing skills, right? The academy looks for people who write, because being a PhD, being a professor, being a scholar is about writing. It is about you expressing your knowledge, you expressing your findings consistently in ways that are attractive and digestible for people, but also in ways that engage with scholarship, existing scholarship, ways that move your field forward, right? So are you able, I was in sociology at Cambridge, so it's like, are you able to contribute to your field of scholarship in a way that is meaningful, that is relevant? One of the things I really loved about Cambridge's sociology program is that they were invested in public sociology, right? So not just like we're gonna navel gaze and write articles that we only read amongst ourselves, but we as a body of scholars are committed to engaging the public and addressing issues that affect the public in ways that allow us to build solutions with the public, right? So I was doing this writing as I was building my business, as I was, sort of defining our first or second film festival, as I was, applying agile methods to building a team and cultivating a thriving team. And I found myself needing to say so much more than what was specific to my topic. Every time I tried to come to my topic, there were more of the emotional and somatic background stuff that was coming out onto the page. And this just kind of kept happening, right? And so I would meet with my advisor and I would commit to like a certain number of pages, and what I would have to show him my writing, and it would be a lot more historical stuff about my experience, which they would call self-ethnography in sociology, right? There was a lot of excavation of what my experience had been and how that had led me to this particular interest, and how my identity as an artist was including, or it was impacting, influencing my scholarship and my research interests, right? And the questions that I was asking. So I just kept writing. But at a certain point, things came to a head, right? There was a certain point at which it was like, okay, you have to submit something. You have to focus on these particular scholars, right? These particular bodies of knowledge. And I was very willing to do that, but it felt like something that was further in the future for me, right? I knew that there was a message that was trying to come up as somebody who had been a writer for years, but who had not necessarily written all the things that I wanted to write. I hadn't written at the volume that I had needed to write or wanted to write. There were all these things that had been suppressed that were now beginning to come up, and I couldn't force them back down, right? I tried, and this is where we come into the medical somatic intersection. I tried to stuff them down. I tried to ignore them sometimes in order to sort of meet these deadlines. But interestingly, the harder I came up against these deadlines, and the more I tried to force myself into the container where that was needed for this deliverable, the more my health deteriorated, the more aggravated my symptoms became. And so things came to a head when I had a particular deadline, I think in like March of 2021. And I was navigating different health issues, but I had a major, major flare up. It might have been triggered by something I ate, but it was a pretty dramatic flare up where I ended up in the hospital. Well, I wasn't admitted, but I ended up in the ER in the UK. And, just engaging with like functional medicine practitioners online, right? And so it just became clear that I was going to need to take medical leave from Cambridge, right? Which they were very supportive of. My department was very supportive. They allowed me to do that. And they told me that I could come back, basically anytime in the future I chose to come back. And so I said, okay, so we packed up, we left Cambridge, we left the UK, came back to the US, and I had already in that first year or two at Cambridge already very deeply been engaging the spiritual. My life has long been spiritual. It's long been a conversation between me and God. And my guidance and my vision for my life and for my contributions to my generation were very much guided by the divine, very much guided by what happened in my prayer, time, very much guided by what I read from scripture, very much guided by what the Holy Spirit was dropping in my heart and in my spirit when I would be in church, right? And it was consistent. The message was consistent. If you've seen me on here before, then you know that I talk about Luke 4:18, Malcolm X, right? Like, Christ came to liberate the oppressed. Malcolm X was holier than thou, right? And was committed to our liberation, ultimately from within, right, through our divine relationship with the divine. And so all of these things were coloring my work and my journey. And when that sort of deadline, moment happened, when things came to a head, it was clear that I was going to need a deeper level of intimacy with God, right? I was going to need a deeper level of understanding of the divine and with the cosmic field, especially because with the health challenges that I had been having for so long at this point, the information that was coming to me, because of the conventional medicine wasn't really reliable and trustworthy as a solution, the information that I was finding that was most applicable had to do with the sort of somatic healing, right? The recognition that our physical symptoms, our physical health is directly correlated with our emotional, mental, spiritual health, right? And one concrete example that I can give has to do with chronic pain, which is what I've experienced, and the notion of holding on to information, right? And how that kind of locks us up in our body physically. So when we are forced to suppress our thoughts, our feelings, and we're not allowed to express them, to share them, we're not given, mirrored containers, right? We don't have people in our lives that we can truly share our hearts with, who will reflect back to us a level of compassion and care and visibility that we need. These are things that can correlate into stiffness, right? Tightness in our bodies. There's also a correlation in terms of, how much we eat, and how like amped we are for life and our sort of energy for life and living, and how that correlates into how we treat ourselves and how much time we get with other people who love us, etc. Right? So there's all these things that influence our mental health, that influence our physiology, that influence our emotional well-being, and that then translate into physical symptoms. And if you're not familiar with the sort of somatic health field, there's so much here on YouTube, there's so much on the internet. um, Resma Menachem, I believe, is one of the key voices that made this more of a mainstream conversation. Another term that I hate, but more of a global conversation. My grandmother's hands, and there was another book, The Body Keeps the Score, right? And so this idea that, one, our bodies are containers of memory from our DNA, from our biology, from what our ancestors passed down to us, from our parents gave us and their DNA, which is not just the physical traits, but it's the emotional traits and the emotional environment that our DNA was cultivated in, right? All these things influence our physical well-being, our health. And so I became much more aware of this in the time that I was at Cambridge. And this is where I became just more focused on like meditation, mindfulness, like the idea of being present and being able to sort of like reconnect with my deepest identity, my truest self, channel that true self, right? Be in communion with that true self and elevate that true self to be able to get myself to the ideal life that I'm meant to live, right? So ultimately, the long and short of it is that leaving Cambridge was directly correlated to my physical health, but not returning to Cambridge, and leaving and not returning were correlated to my spiritual health and my spiritual identity and the conversation I was having with God at the time. And how every time I would try to kind of force myself to go back and just be normal, just be a PhD student, get the PhD, keep it moving, my body would act up again, right? And so one of the conditions for returning was the importance of, just having your sort of medical clearance so that you wouldn't end up leaving again, right? So all of that to say, when I stopped learning in that particular academic container, I did not stop learning. I did not stop researching, right? I continued to intuit from the divine. I continued to learn from God, right? I continued to tap into that divine intuition that had already guided me to Yale, that had guided me through many years in New York, guided me to Yale, guided me to Cambridge, guided me through raising my daughter, right? Guided me through my career. And the message at this time was very much about stillness and hearing, listening, receiving. And I don't know how else to explain it except that that was the university that I now entered, right? There is a place that you get with the divine in your walk as an empath, as a shaman, as a healer. There's a place that you arrive where the initiation, the teaching is ultimately about stillness. It is about your ability to rest and receive, to trust that God is real enough that it's worthwhile for you to sit still and listen to God and receive from God, right? Most of us are cultivated in a way where we see prayer as us, getting on our knees and asking God for things. Um, prayer is beyond that, right? Prayer is about the conversation between us and God, us and the divine, however we conceptualize God, right? And so us coming to a place where we can hear back, right? We can receive the messages from the divine. And so ultimately, my message here is how intelligence, right? Information doesn't just come from books, doesn't just come from professors, doesn't just come from advisors and teachers, but it comes from the somatic intelligence that we cultivate when we are able to become literate, right? In our somatic environment, we can become body literate. There's this idea of body literacy, which is a sort of emerging term, which it just helps you to notice like how your body feels, how your body responds to certain things. Help for you to be able to correlate your emotional state with your physical state and notice that, okay, I have been feeling this way mentally. And now, this particular shift has happened in my body, right? So body literacy is a growing field of study and discussion, but most of us grew up having no idea about the correlation between what we ate and our health, right? Or our emotions and how our bodies felt. And so, body literacy, somatic intelligence helps us to gather much more knowledge and information from our bodies, from the sensations in our bodies, right? The states of our bodies. So, this was my kind of next level of education, was getting into a state where I was comfortable being still, where I was capable of listening to my body and hearing my body. I had always had a certain level of bodily literacy or body literacy, but it was much, much, much heightened now, especially because the stakes were higher, right? Because I felt like my mastery of this particular spiritual understanding was what was going to help heal my chronic pain and inflammation and all sorts of other illnesses or symptoms I was dealing with. And it was also going to translate into my business succeeding, right? My social enterprise becoming impactful and fulfilling its purpose and fulfilling its highest potential, right? So for a very long time, my relationship with the divine and my journey of learning somatically and intuitively translated into writing. Again, something I had always done, but now this writing was a path to healing. This writing was a process of um, metabolizing what was in my body, what was in my field, what I was thinking and feeling, metabolizing, metabolizing it onto the page, right? Alchemizing it onto the page, alchemizing it through writing, through, even this is a form of writing. Like me just like sharing my thoughts with you on here, like doing my Instagram lives like I used to. It's a form of writing. It's expression. It's getting the thoughts out, getting the feelings out through words and through energy, right? And through that sort of kinetic movement. And so I published some of my most important writing over the last several years, writing that may have been embraced in the academy, but that wasn't necessarily always directly and academically linked to my topic, right? I felt that this topic of world making through cultural production, it needed so many layers of understanding before we could just get to the sort of systematic structuring of world making. We had to engage with the question of the divine, right? Because we're talking about African people who are deeply spiritual, deeply religious in any context, right? African Black diaspora people, super, super spiritual people. There's nothing that we do that is not somehow like tied to the spirit realm. And even those of us who may not subscribe to a religion or anything, we have a relationship with the divine, right? It's embedded in our cultures, it's embedded in our languages, it is embedded in the way that we move, the way we make music, like just everything we do is spiritual. And so the idea of Black people participating in world making without a spiritual component didn't make sense to me. And I didn't necessarily have the context or the historical, the sort of academic grounding to be able to argue for that. I needed to just feel it out and experience it. There were not people in my department or at Cambridge at that time that truly could be in dialogue on this with me. I found those people much later through the Black speculative arts movement, and I'm gonna talk much more about that. Right. And so I want to just talk a little bit about spiritual futurism and what that is, right? Because the idea that we could go beyond the academy for our educational knowledge, for our educational gaining, and enter the divine field and actually translate the knowledge, the information that we get from the divine field into something that is tangible knowledge for the new world, the real world, right? Like for us to take knowledge that is somatically intuited, right? Knowledge that we gain simply from meditation, from silence, from stillness, from prayer, from chanting, from singing, from dancing, right? If you are spiritual, then I'm sure you've had moments where insights have come to you, in the most unexpected moments because you were dancing or you were meditating or you were still or you were happy, right? That insight is information, that insight is valuable. So when we're able to take that knowledge and then translate it into something concrete, even if it's just like writing an article, right? Then that is a space in which we can recognize the concrete value of that divine and somatic relationship and divine somatic conversation, right? Because we see that, I was meditating, I was walking in the park, this idea came to me, I sat down and wrote an article. It was the most fluid thing I ever wrote. It was the most beautiful thing. It was the most, insightful thing I ever wrote, right? I'm elevating creatively, I'm elevating academically, elevating professionally through these divine insights or divine downloads that I'm getting from being in moments of stillness, being in moments of trusting the divine, being in moments of listening to the divine, right? So I'm going to give you a definition of spiritual futurism um, that is kind of like a synthesis of my perspective. There's a couple of other authors that have engaged with this. There's Barbara Max Hubbard, who was one of the first to use the term spiritual futurism. There's Elizabeth DiAlto, who talked about spiritual futurism as reconnecting with ancient slash indigenous parts and moving beyond colonized dogma, which is a critical piece. And then Barbara Holmes talks of like Black contemplative mystical futurity, right? So spiritual futurism, my definition, it's a liberation education framework for building liberated futures through divine intelligence, ancestral memory, embodied knowledge, intuition, identity alignment, spiritual discipline, practical skill, and the ability to turn revelation into infrastructure. So, yeah, part of the revelation for me as a futurist who was working towards building a liberated Black future, a liberated global future, the idea of spiritual futurism, it's basically raising the question of how our spiritual experiences, our lived experiences in the spiritual, translate into the type of futures that we want to build, right? And I can use my experience in terms of the downloads, the vision, the insight that gave me Noir Labs, that gave me Portal X, that gave me Noir Press, this ecosystem. These insights were divinely downloaded, right? 99% of the time, it was an insight of God being like, yeah, this is what you're supposed to do. This is how you should do it, right? And so that in and of itself, that act and that experience is spiritual futurism, right? The idea that you are participating in futurism, you are participating in world making, and you are using the divine, accessing the divine as a source for guidance and information in that futurism, in that world making. And this is not so far from contemporary education, right? We are usually taught to separate church and state, right? They tell us that church and state needs to be separate for fairness and for advancement, which couldn't be further from the truth, because at the end of the day, there is no separation of church and state, right? There is always, people are humans with souls. Those of us who have souls, right? We are designed in a way that, they call it the God particle, right? We're designed in a way where we are always looking for something to worship. We're looking for something to fixate on. We're looking for something to be excited about. We're looking for inspiration. And right, to worshiping or honoring or acknowledging or communing with the creator, the divine, the spirit realm. Whether we approach, like apply it to that, or we apply it to our favorite TV show, our favorite political party, our favorite, artist, whatever, whoever we want to be obsessed with, we tend to attach ourselves to some sort of identity or force or community outside of ourselves in order to feel alive, in order to feel connected, right? And coming back to the foundations of education, all of these universities, Cambridge, Oxford, they call it Oxbridge because, there can be a lot of exchange between those places. Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, and Yale are modeled after Oxford and Cambridge. Even looking back in Timbuktu, Mali, right? African universities, it all starts from monastic tradition. It all starts from people contemplating life, people trying to make sense of the human experience and the human condition. And these people are usually monastics, priests, deeply spiritual people, shamans, right? They are living a life that affords them the opportunity to commune with the divine frequently enough and deeply enough that they can download, they can receive that guidance that helps them understand what is to be created, right? Helps them understand what is to be done in the physical realm, how we are meant to operate, the rules we're meant to follow, right? All societies start with some concept of cosmological order, some concept of like, we came from this source and this source told us to do these things in order to continue to proliferate and exist on the earth, right? All communities started that way, one way or the other, even if it is what we call an animist tradition, where you are engaging with nature as God, right? And you are applying your intuitive knowledge as a human being to help you know how to engage nature, how to find food, right? How to find animals, how to build shelter. All of these things that we need to survive, we learned from the spirit realm, right? As human beings. And so when spiritual people go deeper and deeper into the questions of existence, they tend to produce, thought leadership. They tend to produce writing. They tend to produce, whether it's music, right? They tend to produce outputs that express that curiosity and express what they have found in that curiosity, right? It might be poetry. It might be scripture. This is, divinely inspired scripture, right? This is where it comes from. And so all of these institutions that were based on the Bible or based on the Quran, right? All of it goes back to people seeking God's guidance, people seeking divine information, tapping into divine intelligence, and channeling that divine intelligence, that divine understanding as guidelines for how to live as humans. And then we take those guidelines even further. We take them deeper. We study them deeper. So my question for us is, if the current global education system, the Western education system in particular, which most of us are using as a standard, if that Western education system is based on Western spiritual understanding, Western spiritual practice, what happens when we have an education system that is based on indigenous intelligence, indigenous spirituality, right? And it's not either or, obviously, because everything European came out of Africa, right? They learned everything from us in ancient Egypt, Nubia, etc. And so there's not really a separation that can be made where we say, okay, this is European and this is African. But, well, I mean, there is some separation, right? But it's not as cut and dry. So my point is just that universities, as we know them, came from monastic traditions, came from spiritual traditions, came from that practice of training the soul, accessing the soul, cultivating the soul, um, and receiving guidance from the divine on how best to care for the soul and channel the soul in the physical. All right. I'm just looking at my notes. We talked about Oxford, Cambridge, monastic learning, and so how education forms people for a world. So again, this idea that we build educational institutions so that we can teach our communities how to function, right? So that we can sort of distill the knowledge, the information that we got from the divine field into something that people can use and leverage for their own growth and benefit. This is how we get educational institutions. Now, when you build educational structures at scale, what is the purpose of those educational structures? Is it just so people can answer the question of, how to live, or is it to actually prepare people and train people to be able to be in practice, right? To be able to do the things that help them preserve life and have a better life. There's a couple of quotes that I wanted to reference here. So let me see if I can find that. It's not up on my thing. So really on the purpose of education. Okay, in a healthy society, education should cultivate people who can live well, think clearly, and serve the community. Participate in civic life, contribute to the economy, protect the society, and improve the quality of life of the majority. UNESCO frames education as a human right tied to peace, poverty eradication, and sustainable development. Dewey framed education as central to democratic and social progress, and contemporary higher education conversations still emphasize workforce and civic preparation, right? In an extractive society, on the other hand, education functions as a way to create social strata, right? It doesn't cultivate free people, equal people, it cultivates classes. One class receives deep training in leadership, language, confidence, branding, storytelling, self-presentation, institutional navigation, right? Negotiation, ownership, taste, strategy, access. Whereas other classes receive enough programming to obey, perform, consume, compete, and serve, right? So it's not just a question of are we going to school and are we getting an education? It's what type of education are we getting, and whose future and what type of future is that education helping us to create, right? So true education helps people to know themselves, preserve themselves, think critically. Here's how I'm going to come to the Amos Wilson quote. I've quoted it on here before. I will quote it every day if I have to. Amos Wilson wrote Blueprint for Black Power, recommended every leader, anyone who considers themselves a leader of people, of Black people, of a church, of an institution, of an educational institution, about all across the board, we should all be studying Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power. So this is his long quote. Cultural continuity is maintained by educating children in the ways of their culture. And they are educated in the ways of their culture to maintain their culture. to advance its interests, and ultimately to maintain its very survival. That is the fundamental reason people are educated. What does it matter if you learn physics and computer science and everything else and you cannot defend yourself against a biological weapon? A knowledge of computer science, the law, I'm adding medicine, all these other things matters not if you are unable to use that knowledge for your self-defense, right? How smart are we if we cannot cultivate our own safety, right? He continues, if any alien or alienated African sitting on European or alien thrones decided to wipe the face of this earth clean of African people, there's not a single African nation that could defend us against these people. And as long as we are not educated to defend ourselves against these people, then we are being incorrectly educated. Nothing else matters. He says intelligence must be defined in terms of the degree to which it solves your problems. The nature of education today prepares you to solve their problems. As a Black person, as an African person, is preparing you to solve the empire's problems, not your own. That's why you study their books, you go to their schools, you learn their information, their language, their styles, their perceptions, and when you come out of school, you can do a humdinger of a job solving their problems, but you can't solve your own. And then you dare call yourself intelligent. That is Dr. Amos Wilson, right? So education, the purpose of education is self-preservation, it's community preservation, it's family preservation. Education should help us to thrive. It should give us the hard skills to thrive in life, not just as individuals, but as families and as communities. All right. So now the key reason why this matters is that we are experiencing a split. I'd love for you to tell me in the comments if you are conscious of like the new earth split, the new world, new world theology. I see a lot more on my timeline these days about the new earth. And, there are a lot of content creators that I follow, and I'm excited to see it because it wasn't necessarily something that was visible socially before, not as much as it is now. And I have an article up on Noir Press that talks about New World theology, ultimately summarizing how indigenous traditions, so many, even the Abrahamic traditions, so many spiritual traditions teach about this idea of the new world or the new earth, the split. The idea that this world as we know it would cease to exist and a new world would emerge, a world in which, as the Bible talks about it, there would be no suffering, there would be no sickness, right? There would be no violence, no war. It would be, almost utopia, right? This idea that we would live in this world where we are in harmony, we have love, we have sufficiency, abundance, joy, health, right? And this has been a key part of Black liberation theology. The idea that we are fighting to bring heaven here on earth, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, right? This new earth, this new world in which there is no suffering, where suffering has ceased. This is the type of world that we are working to create when we operate within Black liberation theology, right? Because Black liberation theology says that the movement is not some sort of like periphery or peripheral thing to the faith, that the movement is the faith, right? Liberating the oppressed is what Christianity is, and it has always been according to Christ, the Christ that is quoted and documented, right? So we can get into the questions of those texts, but the Christ that we know, even in the KJV Bible, started his ministry by talking about liberating the oppressed, healing the brokenhearted, setting captives free, giving sight to the blind, right? And he walked around healing people left, right, and center, and the people who were usually shunned by society. So Jesus F's with the regular people, the regular ends, right? So in order to transition from this world in which there has been perpetual war, primarily proliferated by the empire, by the European class, right? Perpetual warfare. The US has been at war about 90% of its existence, some sort of war. The goal of their wars is not to win. Their goal of their wars is to be at war. The goal of their wars is to enforce their dominance and their control of the rest of the planet. The goal of their wars is to extract resources, human capital, mineral resources from all over the world, right? It's not about winning. It's about staying at war, about creating, just wreaking havoc and creating chaos and unrest as much as they can, so that that gives them access to our minds, our energy fields, our attention, our fear. They harvest our fear, and they're harvesting our coltan, our oil, our gold. They're stealing it, right? So that old world intelligence, the type of intelligence that Yale props up, Harvard props up, Oxford, Cambridge prop up, it is that sort of measurable intelligence that is directly tied to upholding the empire, right? There's certain people, certain classes of people who are trained to be able to have confidence, who are trained with their identity, right? Who are trained to know their place in history, know what their ancestors did in history, know what people who look like them did in history. And then there are those who are trained in a way where they're completely erased from history. They don't even get to learn their history, or they only learned that they were slaves, right? Their ancestors were slaves. And so the empire's education structure is intentional about cultivating a leadership class and cultivating a slave class, and then whatever is in between, right? And the Harvards, the Yales, the Cambridges, the Oxfords, they are they are imperative to that goal, right? If you don't have institutions that reinforce these structures and these rules, if you don't have institutions that reward operating within the imperial frame, then you can't maintain the imperial frame. And so, yes, some of us do get through these institutions as radical as we could ever be. Some of us are radicalized in these institutions, absolutely. There, and Yale is a place. As much as I'm talking ish, Yale. My 2 years at Yale was two of the best years of my life. It was really an amazing time because it was some of you know, the window where I had some level of intellectual parity. Some intellectual um, peership, right? People who were equally curious, who were interested in interrogating, critical questions of life, and people who, particularly at Yale, were committed to making the world a better place. Yale has recently changed its mission. We're going to talk about that in future conversations, but when I was there, it was about leadership in society and making the world a better place. And you saw that in the people that you met at Yale. There was an overwhelming, it was kind of over indexing on people who wanted to make a contribution that wasn't just about their pockets, wasn't just about their brand, but was about truly seeing improvement in the lives of others. And you can have that coexist with people like your vice president. It's not like he went there and then everybody was human and compassionate after that. No, the same university still outputs people who are warmongers, still outputs people who uphold the genocidal infrastructure, right? And so there are exceptions to the rule, and people like us who get through and with our souls intact and with our values intact. But these institutions are not necessarily designed to be that. And even sometimes, even with the idea of serving the public and doing what's best for the world, it's still coming from a very Eurocentric understanding that minimizes our knowledge of the violence of empire, the harm of empire. It's not an African epistemology, right? In my notes, I have something about the Yale bubble, and how the Yale bubble is epistemic, right? It's not just this, this metaphor for the social group within the Yale University that rejects everybody who's outside of the university. This is a bubble that is metaphorical across the academy, right? When we look at these Ivies or these fancy universities and we say, like, that is the standard. That's what we aspire to. That's what it means to be intelligent. That's what it means to have arrived, is that you've gone to these schools and you've gotten this type of knowledge. Whereas those institutions depend heavily on the ravaging of indigenous people. They depend heavily, even Yale itself, with the community that lives outside the university. The population of unhoused people in the city is insane. And Yale looks the other way, as opposed to they could just write one check and eradicate that problem in one day, but they won't. Why? I'm gonna let you answer that for yourself. Right? So, New World Intelligence, I'm gonna see if I can get the quotes from Nana Gessi. So, I'm always shouting out Nana Gessi, who is, um, he's a PhD. He talks on YouTube. His page is Inner Mileage. He talks about the empaths. He really speaks to us empaths and how our intelligences and our presence in the world is what is critical for this new earth split, this new world, right? This creation of this new world. That people who feel and are compassionate towards humanity are the people who have the capacity and the skill sets to actually build solutions that will serve humanity and that will uplift humanity and bring us out of this this cycle of war and violence and genocide. Let me see if I can get his quote. He says, modern psychology has already dismantled the myth of a singular intelligence. Howard Gardner, who was at Harvard, may still be there, I'm not sure, demonstrated that intelligence manifests across many domains. Um, Most social systems reward finite intelligence. That's a type of intelligence that can be measured with an exam. But empaths operate from an expansive intelligence, which is much more contextual, relational, pattern based, non-linear, and field sensitive, right? This sort of intuitive somatic knowledge, somatic intelligence senses before it asserts, integrates before it declares. It's a humble intelligence. It's a deep intelligence that understands that the more you see, the more you realize how little is fully graspable, right? I definitely recommend if you're an empath, if you are a world maker, if you're a world, you want to be leading us to the new world, definitely encourage you to check out his work. Um, but yeah, the type of intelligence that is needed for a liberated world asks us if we can hear God. Like the educational institutions that will be built to bring us into this new world, they're going to require us to be able to commune with the divine. Just like these institutions were built on a communion, a relationship with the divine as they understood it then, those mystics understood it then. Liberated Black, Indigenous, empaths, shamans, spiritualists, we will be the ones who will provide that foundation, that monastic foundation for New World education systems. Many of us already exist. Many of these institutions and universities already exist. They may just need to be infused with this injection, this new injection of empath, of shamanic, of indigenous spiritual intelligence. But yeah, I mean, that monastic type of education we need there. I swear there's nothing on my calendar, but I just got a call, so I'm gonna just check. Okay, so I just want to speak to the visionaries, the leaders, those who are world makers, world builders. Like, we need you. One, we need you, and two, we need each other. And so I'm fortunate that I get to follow a lot of these types of people on LinkedIn. Sometimes I see them on my Insta or whatever. We have to come together, right? And so a lot of us are working together. I always shout out BSAM, Black Speculative Arts Movement. That is a community of Black scholars, Black futurists, Black artists who are working together to shape this new liberated world, right? From their scholarship, from their studies, from their teachings. Those who are building institutions, those who are building technology platforms, those who are building frameworks, those who are educating us on Ubuntu, shout out to Dobichoki, um, those who are tapping into the level of intelligence that it takes for us to shape and design our own way of being, right? For us to tap into the knowledge of our ancestors, the somatic intelligence that we have in our bodies and our DNA and our memory, in order to translate that into the rules for engagement, for it to be embedded in our music, in our films, in our TV shows, in our content. That is what is essential, and that is what is needed for the new world, the new liberated world. And so, if you are in that category, I just want to big you up and encourage you, and I just want to send you some strength, some power, some life force, some energy, because you are needed, you are essential, and it is in us working together and integrating our knowledge and becoming community and learning, growing our capacity for true, deep, like intimate community, sustainable community. That's what's going to deliver this new liberated world. So let me just see if there's anything else. Oh, I didn't talk about identity. I talked about identity coaching and identity alignment in my previous lives. This is where we'll pick it up, I guess, next time. But the long and short of it, I'm teaching on this as a means to integrate the knowledge that I have contributed, to this realm over my career, right? I started out in educational consulting in a sense. I've been tutor. I've been a tutor. I've been an operational lead for an educational consulting company. I have been a coach to people, right? So informal and formal contexts, I have coached people towards that identity, that liberated identity for themselves, the identity, the version of themselves that is liberated in terms of being able to use their gifts, right, to make a living, to have a fulfilled and joyful life, right? This is really the sort of integrated offering that I'm focusing on in this time, right? If you look at the ecosystem, Noir Labs, Norfest, Noir Press, Portal X, these are all educational tools. These are all re-educational tools, right? The film festival, the reason we show aspirational Black films is to educate us, show us, teach us what it's like to be free, right? What it looks like and how it feels somatically to be free Black people in the world. The music, the art of that, right? Consuming that is imprinting on our nervous systems and giving us a new frame of understanding, a new frame of reference. NARPress, I mean, that's kind of obvious, right? If you go to narpress.org, you see all the thought leadership that we've provided there and the things that we share on our LinkedIn, our Instagram, right? This is thought leadership that helps you to see the new liberated world, see a new way of doing things, a new way of being. And yeah, it's a form of re-education. Portal X, your pocket companion to your North Star. You can go to portalx.space and get an account. Again, re-educating you, cultivating you along the path of your liberated identity, your North Star identity, the person that you're aiming to become, that you're working to become, and helping you to educate yourself and train yourself to actually become that person, right? So if you are seeking support with your career trajectory, whether you are applying to college this fall, you're applying to grad school, you want to apply to grad school this fall, you are applying to new jobs, new opportunities, or you just an entrepreneur creative that wants to attract your people. I have kind of a superpower for helping people with these things, right? Helping you align your identity with your message, with your purpose, with your goals, and helping you tell the story that will attract the people that you want to you. So when you're applying to college, it still boils down to telling the story that that department, that university will be magnetized towards and want to have you in their environment, right? And it's how do you tell that story? How do you get that story aligned with who you are? When you're applying to grad school, same thing. These institutions want to be part of a brand that is moving forward, and you have to be able to curate your journey and your story in a way that helps them see that. When you're looking for jobs, when you're looking for clientele, it always comes back. Opportunities. I talk about the artist, one particular artist. Shout out to Kat Smith, who was not practicing art, even though she was well trained and she was highly talented. When I met her in 2022, she was not making art at all. She had been, she had put her brushes away. She was not paying attention to that part of her life. She was being a mother and a wife. She was working, and a few months with me, and she was getting commissioned again. She was recently recognized by the state of Connecticut as I'm just like, wow, look at that. And there's so many other examples of people who I have coached on the trajectory to being more fulfilled and more prosperous and living a more fulfilled life. So all of my work, you could say it falls under educational consulting. And I work with individuals, I work with institutions. We've worked with Yale, Amazon, mentioned Verizon and FedEx in the past as like tech, platforms or tech support that I provided, technical leadership. So all of that goes into this ecosystem and the tools that we offer in the ecosystem. But if you come to me as an individual and you want that identity coaching, I will work with you one-on-one. And I can also leverage the technology that we've built to help accelerate your journey and your process, right? If you come to me as a department, if you come to me as an institution, I can help you design programs for your students, for your organization, that will help everybody to be cultivated in a way that advances their education, advances their professional skill set and training, and advances your success as an institution or as an organization. So if you're interested in more of that, you can email us team@noirlabs, team@noirlabs.org. There will be other ways to get in touch. I'll put some stuff in the description, but yeah, that's the general idea. So long and short, left Cambridge to enter the realm of spiritual futurism and built some technology and ecosystem to support scaling this type of knowledge, not just leaving book knowledge, not to say either or, But it's about us being able to leverage an integration of the two, and all the different forms of knowledge that we have access to as human beings. Beyond book and audio and whatever, our somatic intelligence can serve us to get to our liberated selves, our highest selves. So I look forward to living in the new liberated world with you, and I hope that this has been fruitful and supportive for you in your journey to liberation from within. Shout out, or join me, subscribe to Soul Medicine at Substack, soulmedicine.substack.com. You can also subscribe to NARPress, narpress.org/join. And if you want to support our work at NAR Labs, go to narlabs.org/support. You can find out how to work with us as become a client and how to just contribute to our ecosystem. All right. I appreciate y'all. It's been a blessing, and we'll talk soon. Peace.